Some questions change everything. They arrive without warning, cutting through the ordinary fabric of life like lightning through darkness. For Sarah Mitchell, that question came on a Tuesday night in the Nevada desert, spoken by a stranger who appeared at her campfire like a ghost from another world. She had been running from her past for 3 months, living out of her battered Honda Civic, when a simple inquiry about directions became the catalyst that would either save her life or destroy what little remained of it. The desert has a way of stripping people down to their essence, of revealing truths that city lights and constant noise usually hide. What Sarah discovered on that remote stretch of highway, miles from civilization, was that sometimes the most dangerous journeys are the ones that lead us back to ourselves. And, sometimes, the people we meet in the most unlikely places are exactly who we need to find our way home. Sarah Mitchell had been staring at the same constellation for 20 minutes when she heard the footsteps. The fire crackled between her and the darkness, sending orange sparks spiraling into the star-drunk Nevada sky. She had chosen this spot carefully, 3 miles off Highway 50, hidden behind a cluster of Joshua trees that looked like ancient sentinels in the moonlight. No one should have found her here. The footsteps stopped just beyond the circle of light. Sarah's hand moved slowly toward the baseball bat she kept beside her folding chair, the same aluminum Louisville Slugger she had grabbed from her apartment in Phoenix 3 months ago. Back when she still had an apartment. Back when she still had a life worth living. "Easy there," a voice called out from the darkness. Male, older, with a slight rasp that spoke of too many cigarettes or too much desert air. "I'm not looking for trouble. Just saw your fire and thought maybe you had some water to spare." Sarah squinted into the blackness beyond her campfire. The stranger remained hidden in shadows, which somehow made her feel slightly better. If he meant harm, surely he would have rushed her by now. Still, her grip tightened on the bat. "I don't have much," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Maybe a bottle or two." "That would be a blessing," the man replied. "My truck broke down about a mile back. Radiator gave out. I've been walking since sunset." Something in his tone made Sarah relax slightly. There was genuine exhaustion there, the kind of bone-deep weariness she recognized in herself. She had been carrying it for months now, ever since the night that changed everything. The night she stopped being Sarah Mitchell, successful marketing director, and became Sarah Mitchell, fugitive from her own life. "You can come closer," she said finally. "But keep your hands where I can see them." The man stepped into the light, and Sarah got her first good look at him. He was older than his voice suggested, maybe 65, with silver hair that caught the firelight and deep lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into bright horizons. He wore faded jeans, work boots, and a flannel shirt that had seen better decades. Despite his obvious exhaustion, he moved with the careful grace of someone accustomed to rough country. "Name's Frank," he said, stopping a respectful distance from her chair. "Frank Delacroix. And I want you to know I appreciate this kindness." Sarah reached into her cooler and pulled out a bottle of water, tossing it to him. He caught it with both hands and immediately broke the seal, drinking deeply. She watched him gulp down half the bottle before coming up for air. "Thank you," he breathed. "I was starting to think I might not make it to sunrise." "What happened to your truck?" Sarah asked. She still held the bat, but loosely now, more out of habit than fear. Frank settled himself on a large rock across from her, uninvited but not unwelcome. 1986 Chevy pickup. "She's been good to me for 15 years, but I guess even the faithful have their limits." Radiator hose split about an hour after dark. "I had enough water to get her limping for a while, but then the whole system gave out." He took another long drink, then studied Sarah across the flames. "Now, I don't mean to pry, but what's a young woman like you doing out here all alone? This isn't exactly tourist country." Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the same feeling she got whenever anyone asked personal questions. She had practiced her cover story for months, but somehow, sitting across from this weathered stranger in the middle of nowhere, the lies felt heavier than usual. "I'm traveling," she said simply. "Seeing the country." Frank nodded slowly, but his eyes suggested he heard more than she was saying. "Traveling," he repeated. "That's a fine thing. I've done my share of it over the years. Sometimes a person needs to put some miles between themselves and whatever's chasing them. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had been so careful, so cautious about revealing anything about her situation. How could this stranger see through her so easily? I don't know what you mean, she said, but even she could hear how unconvincing it sounded. Frank smiled, and it was a kind expression, free of judgment. Miss, I've been around long enough to recognize someone who's running. I've done my share of it. The question is, are you running towards something or away from it? Sarah stared at him, feeling exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the vast desert surrounding them. For 3 months, she had been completely alone with her thoughts, her fears, her guilt. She had spoken to gas station clerks and diner waitresses, exchanged pleasantries with other travelers, but she hadn't had a real conversation with another human being since the night she left Phoenix. Why does it matter? She asked finally. Because, Frank said, finishing the bottle of water, running towards something gives you hope. Running away from something just wears you down until there's nothing left. The fire popped and hissed between them. Sarah found herself studying this stranger's face in the dancing light. There was something deeply settled about him, as if he had made peace with difficult truths long ago. She envied him that peace. What if what you're running from is yourself? She heard herself ask. What if you can't escape because the thing chasing you is inside your own head? Frank leaned forward, his expression growing more serious. Well, then, running isn't going to solve much, is it? You can drive to Alaska or Mexico or the middle of the Pacific Ocean, but you're still going to wake up with the same thoughts, the same memories, the same regrets. Sarah felt tears threatening and blinked them back angrily. She had cried enough over the past 3 months to fill a reservoir. She was tired of crying, tired of feeling sorry for herself, tired of reliving the same terrible night over and over in her mind. So what's the answer then? She asked. If running doesn't work, what does? Frank was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, more thoughtful. I think maybe the answer is stopping. Finding a place to make a stand. Deciding that whatever's chasing you, you're going to face it head-on instead of wearing yourself out trying to stay ahead of it. That's easy for you to say, Sarah replied with more bitterness than she intended. You don't know what I've done. What I'm responsible for. No, Frank agreed. I don't. But I know what I've done, what I've been responsible for. And I know that carrying guilt is like carrying a backpack full of stones. Every day it gets heavier, and every day it slows you down a little more, until eventually you can't move at all. Sarah looked across the fire at this stranger who spoke about guilt and regret as if they were old friends. There was something in his manner, something in the way he chose his words, that suggested he wasn't speaking hypothetically. What did you do? She asked quietly. Frank smiled again, but this time there was sadness in it. Now that's a long story. And it's getting late. But I'll tell you this much, the thing that finally saved me wasn't running away from what I'd done. It was turning around and walking back toward it. He stood up slowly, his joints protesting the movement. I should try to get some sleep. If you don't mind, I'll bed down over there by those rocks. Come morning, maybe you could give me a ride back to my truck? I've got some tools and spare parts. Might be able to get her running again. Sarah nodded. Of course. As Frank gathered his small pack and moved toward the rocks, Sarah called out to him. Frank? What you said about turning around and walking back toward what you'd done. How do you know when you're ready for that? He paused and looked back at her across the dying fire. I think you know you're ready when staying where you are becomes more painful than facing what you left behind. With that, he disappeared into the shadows, leaving Sarah alone with the fire and her thoughts. She sat there for another hour, watching the flames gradually subside, thinking about backpacks full of stones and the weight of carrying guilt. The desert was quiet around her except for the occasional call of a night bird or the distant howl of a coyote. For the first time in months, Sarah found herself thinking not about the past, but about the future. About what it might feel like to stop running. About what it might mean to turn around and walked back toward the thing that had driven her into the desert in the first place. She had no way of knowing that this chance encounter with a broken-down truck and a stranger named Frank would change the direction of her life. But, as she finally banked the fire and settled into her sleeping bag, Sarah Mitchell began to consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, it was time to stop running. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, and, somewhere in the darkness, a man who understood the weight of guilt tried to find a comfortable position on the hard desert ground. Neither of them slept particularly well, but both of them dreamed of going home. The desert sunrise painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, casting long shadows across the scrubland as Sarah broke camp. Frank was already awake, sitting on his makeshift bed with his back against a boulder, watching the horizon with the patient attention of someone accustomed to early mornings and wide-open spaces. "Beautiful out here," he said as Sarah folded her sleeping bag. "Never gets old, watching the sun come up over country like this." Sarah nodded, though she had barely noticed the sunrise. Her mind was still churning over their conversation from the night before, over his words about turning around and walking back toward what you'd done. She had been running for so long that the idea of stopping, of facing her past, felt both terrifying and oddly appealing. They ate a simple breakfast of instant oatmeal and coffee heated over the revived campfire, making small talk about the weather and the landscape. But there was an undercurrent to their conversation, an awareness that something significant had shifted between them during the night. They were no longer complete strangers, though they were not yet friends. Frank's truck was exactly where he said it would be, pulled over on the shoulder of a dirt road that barely qualified as more than tire tracks in the sand. It was an ancient Chevy, faded blue with patches of rust and primer, but it looked sturdy and well-maintained despite its age. "She's not much to look at," Frank said with obvious affection, "but she's taken me everywhere I needed to go for the past 15 years. Sarah watched him pop the hood and begin examining the engine with the practiced movements of someone who understood machinery. His hands were scarred and calloused, the hands of a man who had spent his life working with tools and motors and stubborn mechanical problems. "What do you do for a living?" she asked. "I mean, when you're not breaking down in the desert." Frank glanced up from the engine compartment. "Retired now, but I spent 30 years as a long-haul trucker. Drove everything from 18-wheelers to delivery trucks. Saw every state in the Union at least a dozen times, and most of them a lot more than that." He returned to his work, and Sarah found herself studying his face as he concentrated on the broken radiator hose. There was something he wasn't telling her, something that went deeper than simple mechanical failure and chance encounters. She had developed a sixth sense for secrets over the past few months, perhaps because she was carrying so many of her own. "Is that why you understand about running?" she asked. "Because you've spent so much time on the road?" Frank's hands stilled for a moment, then resumed their work. "Partly," he said. "But mostly because I spent the better part of 10 years running from something myself. Running from a mistake that cost someone their life." The words hung in the desert air between them like heat shimmer. Sarah felt her chest tighten, recognizing the tone of someone about to share a burden they had carried alone for too long. "You don't have to tell me," she said quietly. "Maybe I need to," Frank replied. He straightened up and wiped his hands on a rag, then leaned against the truck's fender. "Maybe that's why I'm here, why my truck broke down right where you happen to be camping. Maybe some things aren't as random as they seem." Sarah waited, understanding instinctively that this was a story that couldn't be rushed. Frank stared out at the horizon for a long moment before beginning. "This was about 12 years ago. I was driving freight down through Arizona, running late on a delivery that should have been there the day before. My dispatcher was breathing down my neck, threatening to dock my pay if I didn't make up time." He paused, seeming to gather himself. "There's a stretch of 2-lane highway between Flagstaff and Phoenix, beautiful country but tricky driving. Lots of curves, steep grades, places where you can't see what's coming around the next bend." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert morning air. She knew that stretch of highway, had driven it many times during her years in Phoenix. More importantly, she recognized the tone of Frank's voice, the careful way he was choosing his words. It was the same tone she used when she tried to tell herself the story of her own disaster. "I was pushing too hard," Frank continued. taking those curves faster than I should have, riding my brakes on the downhill stretches. I kept telling myself I could make up the time, that I just needed to focus and drive smart. He stopped talking and picked up a wrench, turning it over in his hands without really seeing it. Sarah wanted to tell him he didn't have to continue, but she sensed that this story needed to be told, that it had been waiting inside him for years. There was this little sedan in front of me, he said finally. Blue Honda, looked a lot like that car of yours actually. Older couple, probably in their 70s, driving exactly the speed limit and being careful around the curves. They were doing everything right. Sarah's stomach began to clench as she realized where this story was heading. I got impatient, Frank said, his voice growing quieter. Started following too close, thinking I could pressure them into going faster or find a place to pass. There was a curve coming up, a sharp right-hander with a guardrail on the outside and a steep drop-off beyond that. I should have backed off, given them space. He set down the wrench and looked directly at Sarah for the first time since he started talking. Instead, I moved out into the oncoming lane to see if I could pass. But there was another car coming around that curve, and suddenly, there wasn't enough room for all three of us. Sarah closed her eyes, not wanting to hear the rest but knowing she needed to. The Honda swerved to give me room to get back into my lane, Frank continued. They went through the guardrail and down into the canyon. Both of them died on impact. Harold and Martha Brennan, married 48 years. They were driving back from visiting their new granddaughter. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. Sarah opened her eyes and saw that Frank was crying, tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on his weathered cheeks. The investigating officer said it wasn't my fault, he said. Said the other driver was going too fast for conditions, that the Honda overcorrected when they tried to avoid me. No charges were filed. Insurance called it an accident. But you knew better, Sarah said softly. Frank nodded. I knew better. I knew that if I hadn't been tailgating, if I hadn't been so damn impatient, Harold and Martha would have made it home to their family. Instead, they died because I was more worried about a delivery deadline than I was about driving safe. Sarah felt her own tears starting, recognizing the familiar weight of guilt and self-recrimination. What did you do afterward? What you're doing, Frank said with a bitter laugh. I ran. Quit my job, sold my house, loaded everything I owned into this truck and started driving. Told myself I was looking for peace, for a place where I could forget what happened. Spent 10 years bouncing from town to town, taking odd jobs, never staying anywhere long enough to form real connections with people. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. Took me all that time to realize I wasn't looking for peace. I was looking for punishment. I thought if I made myself miserable enough, if I gave up everything that mattered to me, maybe it would somehow balance the scales for what I'd done. Did it work? Sarah asked. No, Frank said simply. All it did was waste 10 years of my life and make the world a little bit worse by taking away whatever good I might have been able to do during that time. He moved back to the truck's engine and resumed working on the radiator hose. Finally, got tired of carrying that backpack full of stones I mentioned last night. Started thinking about Harold and Martha, about what kind of people they were. From what I learned about them, they weren't the type to want someone destroying their life over guilt about their death. Sarah watched him work, thinking about his words. So what did you do? I went to their funeral, Frank said. 12 years late, but I went. Found their grave in a little cemetery outside Phoenix and sat there for hours, talking to them like they were still alive. Told them how sorry I was, how much I regretted what happened, how I'd wasted years of my life trying to punish myself instead of trying to honor their memory. He looked up at Sarah again. And, you know what? Sitting there in that cemetery, I finally understood something. The best way to honor Harold and Martha wasn't to destroy my own life. It was to live it better. To be more careful, more thoughtful, more aware of how my actions affect other people. Sarah felt something shifting inside her chest, like a knot that had been tied too tight finally, beginning to loosen. Is that why you're here? Living better? Frank smiled, and this time there was genuine warmth in it. I'm here because I decided to stop running away from what I'd done and start running toward what I could still do. Been volunteering at a veterans center in Reno for the past 2 years. Helping guys who are struggling with their own guilt and trauma. Turns out there's a lot of us carrying stones in our backpacks. He tightened the clamp on the new radiator hose and straightened up. That should do it. Want to give her a try? Sarah nodded, though her mind was spinning with everything Frank had shared. She watched him climb into the cab and turn the key. The engine coughed once, then caught and settled into a steady idle. Frank let it run for a few minutes, monitoring the temperature gauge, then shut it off with obvious satisfaction. She'll get me home, he said, climbing out. Thanks for the ride out here. And thanks for listening. Thank you for telling me, Sarah said. I know it couldn't have been easy. Frank studied her face carefully. Your turn now, he said gently. What's chasing you, Sarah? What stones are you carrying? Sarah felt her throat tighten. She had kept her story locked inside for so long that speaking about it felt almost physically impossible. But, looking at this man who had trusted her with his deepest shame, she found herself wanting to share the burden she had been carrying alone. There was an accident, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. 3 months ago. A little girl died because of something I did. Because of a choice I made. Frank nodded encouragingly, and Sarah took a shaky breath before continuing. For the first time since that terrible night in Phoenix, she began to tell someone the truth about what had driven her into the desert, about the guilt that had been eating her alive 1 mile at a time. The sun climbed higher in the desert sky as two strangers stood beside a broken-down truck and shared the weight of their respective tragedies, each discovering that sometimes the most healing thing you can do is speak your deepest shame out loud to someone who understands the language of regret. Sarah's voice broke as she reached the hardest part of her story. Frank listened without interruption, his weathered face grave with understanding as she described the night that had shattered her world and sent her fleeing into the desert. I was working late at the agency, she said, staring at the ground between her feet. We had this big campaign launched the next morning for a new children's medication. The client was breathing down our necks about some last-minute changes to the advertising copy. She paused, remembering the fluorescent lights of her office, the stack of approval forms on her desk, the pressure to get everything perfect before the morning deadline. It felt like a lifetime ago, though it had only been 3 months. The medication was for childhood asthma, she continued. Important stuff, potentially life-saving for kids who couldn't control their symptoms with regular inhalers. But there was this warning label the FDA required, something about potential side effects in children under 6. Frank remained silent, but Sarah could feel his attention like a physical presence. After months of keeping this story locked inside, the words felt both terrifying and liberating as they spilled out. The client wanted to minimize the warning, Sarah said. Make it smaller, bury it in the fine print. They said it would scare parents away from a medication that could really help their kids. They had studies showing the benefits outweighed the risks, that the side effects were extremely rare. She looked up at Frank, searching his face for judgment and finding only patience. I knew it was wrong. I knew that warning needed to be prominent, easy to read. But I was up for a promotion, and this client represented a huge account for the agency. My boss made it clear that keeping them happy was my top priority. The desert wind picked up, scattering dust devils across the hardpan. Sarah watched one spin itself to pieces against a cluster of sagebrush, thinking about how quickly things could fall apart when the foundation wasn't solid. I changed the layout, she said quietly. Made the warning smaller, moved it to a place where it would be less noticeable. Told myself I was just following orders, that it wasn't really my decision. Frank nodded slowly, recognizing the familiar rhythm of rationalization and self-deception. But you knew better. I knew better, Sarah confirmed. And 3 weeks after the campaign launched, a little girl named Emma Rodriguez died from complications related to that medication. She was 4 years old. Her parents never saw the warning because I had made it too small to notice. The words hung in the air like an accusation. Sarah had replayed them in her mind thousands of times over the past 3 months, but speaking them aloud to another person made them feel more real, more terrible, and somehow more bearable all at once. Her parents sued the pharmaceutical company, she continued. During the legal discovery process, they found internal agency emails showing that I had deliberately minimized the warning against FDA guidelines. The story hit the news. Marketing executive's deadly decision. That's what the headline said. Frank winced sympathetically. The media doesn't usually worry much about context or complexity. The worst part is, they weren't wrong, Sarah said. I did make a deadly decision. I chose my career over a child's safety, and Emma Rodriguez died because of it. Her parents, Miguel and Rosa, lost their daughter because I was too much of a coward to stand up to my boss and the client. She felt the familiar wave of nausea that always accompanied thoughts of Emma's parents, of their grief and anger during the lawsuit proceedings. Sarah had attended every day of the trial, watching from the back of the courtroom as they testified about their daughter's final hours, about the hospital room where she had struggled to breathe while the medication her parents thought would help her slowly shut down her kidneys. The agency fired me immediately, Sarah said. Threw me under the bus to protect themselves and the client. Said I had acted without authorization, that the changes to the warning label were my decision alone. Technically, that was true. I was the one who actually made the changes. Frank was quiet for a long moment, then asked, "What happened with the lawsuit?" "Settled out of court for $12 million, Sarah replied. The pharmaceutical company paid, but they also released a statement saying their marketing partner had failed to follow FDA guidelines. My name was all over the news again. I became the face of corporate irresponsibility, the person who put profits ahead of children's lives." She kicked at a small stone, sending it skittering across the desert floor. The legal settlement was supposed to include a confidentiality agreement, but somehow details kept leaking to the press. I started getting death threats. People would recognize me at the grocery store, at coffee shops. Someone threw a rock through my apartment window with a note calling me a child killer. Frank's expression darkened. That's when you started running. Sarah nodded. I couldn't handle it anymore. The guilt was eating me alive, and the media attention made it impossible to process what had happened. So I packed my car and just started driving. Told myself I needed time to think, to figure out how to move forward. But thinking didn't help, Frank said gently. Thinking made it worse, Sarah admitted. Every mile I drove, every night I spent in some anonymous motel or campground, I kept replaying that decision over and over. Imagining what would have happened if I had stood up to my boss, if I had refused to minimize the warning. Emma Rodriguez would still be alive. Her parents wouldn't be grieving. I wouldn't be hiding in the desert like some kind of fugitive. Frank walked over to his truck and pulled out a thermos, pouring coffee into 2 metal cups. He handed one to Sarah and sat down on the truck's tailgate, patting the spot beside him in invitation. You know what the hardest thing about guilt is, he said as Sarah joined him. It makes us stupid. Makes us think that suffering is somehow productive, that if we punish ourselves enough, we can somehow undo what we've done. Sarah sipped the bitter coffee and considered his words. Isn't suffering appropriate though? Shouldn't I feel terrible about what happened to Emma? Feeling terrible and destroying yourself are two different things, Frank replied. Emma Rodriguez deserves to be remembered, and what happened to her should matter. But wasting your life in the desert doesn't honor her memory any more than my years of wandering honored Harold and Martha. He set down his coffee cup and turned to face her directly. The question is, what would honor her memory? What would make her death mean something? Sarah felt tears starting again, but this time they felt different. Less like self-pity and more like genuine grief for a little girl she had never met but whose life she had helped cut short. I don't know, she whispered. I don't know how to make it right. Frank reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a business card, worn and creased from being handled many times. He handed it to Sarah, who read it with surprise. Rodriguez Family Foundation, she said. Miguel and Rosa Rodriguez? Frank nodded. I've been carrying that card for 6 months now, ever since I saw a news story about the foundation they started in their daughter's memory. They're working to strengthen FDA oversight of pharmaceutical advertising, to make sure warning labels are clear and prominent. Sarah stared at the card, her hands shaking slightly. Where did you get this? From a lawyer friend of mine in Phoenix, Frank said. I asked him to do some research after I heard about your case. Thought there might come a time when you'd want to know what Emma's parents were doing with their grief. Sarah looked up at him in amazement. You knew who I was? From the beginning? Frank smiled sadly. Recognized your name when you mentioned Phoenix, and your car matched the description from the news stories. But I needed to hear your version of what happened before I could decide whether you were worth helping. And? Sarah asked, afraid of the answer. And you're carrying enough guilt to kill a horse, Frank said. But you're also the first person I've met who takes full responsibility for their mistakes instead of trying to blame someone else. That tells me something important about your character. Sarah felt something shifting inside her chest again, the same sensation she had experienced when Frank first shared his story. It was like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, or the first breath of air after being underwater too long. What am I supposed to do with this? She asked, holding up the business card. That's your choice, Frank replied. But, if I were you, I'd start by having a conversation with Emma's parents. Not to ask for forgiveness, because that's not something you can ask for. But, to ask how you can help with their work, how you can use your experience to make sure what happened to Emma doesn't happen to other children. Sarah studied the card, thinking about Miguel and Rosa Rodriguez and the unimaginable strength it must have taken to channel their grief into action rather than revenge. They might not want to see me, she said. I'm the person who killed their daughter. Maybe, Frank agreed. But, they're also the people who turned their tragedy into a mission to protect other children. That suggests they understand something about redemption and second chances. Frank finished his coffee and stood up. I need to get back on the road. Long drive ahead of me. Sarah looked around at the vast desert landscape, suddenly aware of how small and isolated she had become during her months of running. The thought of returning to Phoenix, of facing Emma's parents and the media and her own complicated emotions, felt overwhelming. But, for the first time in months, it also felt necessary. Frank, she said as he prepared to leave. Thank you. For sharing your story, for listening to mine, for carrying that business card around. I don't know if I would have found the courage to stop running without meeting you. Frank smiled and climbed into his truck. Sometimes the people we meet in the desert are exactly the people we need to meet. Take care of yourself, Sarah. And remember what I said about backpacks full of stones. Eventually, you have to set them down if you want to move forward. As his truck disappeared down the dirt road in a cloud of dust, Sarah sat alone in the desert silence, holding the Rodriguez Family Foundation business card and thinking about the long journey home. She understood now that running had never been about finding peace or escape. It had been about avoiding the hardest thing of all, taking responsibility for her choices and finding a way to live with the consequences. 2 days later, Sarah Mitchell drove her battered Honda Civic back into Phoenix for the first time in 3 months. The city skyline looked different somehow, less threatening and more like a place where real people lived and worked and struggled with difficult decisions. She had called the foundation that morning, spoken to Rosa Rodriguez herself, and arranged to meet the following day. The conversation would be difficult, perhaps impossible. There were no guarantees that Emma's parents would want anything to do with the woman who had contributed to their daughter's death. But Sarah had learned something important from her encounter with a stranger in the desert: running away from your mistakes doesn't make them disappear. The only way forward is through, back toward the very thing you've been fleeing, armed with whatever wisdom and strength you've gained along the way. That night, Sarah checked into a small hotel near the foundation's offices and tried to prepare for the most important conversation of her life. She thought about Emma Rodriguez, about Frank and his long journey toward redemption, about the difference between guilt that destroys and guilt that motivates. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought, but, for the first time in months, Sarah Mitchell was no longer running from her future. She was walking toward it, one difficult step at a time.